possibly a layperson's summary of the case, and I think it would be very important to read that because it has to do with a claim taken by Indigenous people. So I'm assuming that that doesn't go so far as to give a natural entity a right in the absence of an understanding of that natural entity in terms of the rights of the Indigenous. So I would say that we would have to qualify that quite carefully. I'm surmising that we might have to qualify that quite carefully. And the other issue, just about the question raised by Ben about rights for nature or human rights, I mean, I think we have to be very practical and consider, who are the actors? And the actors that can enforce rights are humans. And I mean, I often almost despair a little of us running away with ourselves conceptually. That what we need to do is to look at an understanding of human rights that include environmental values. I mean, we know who the actors are. Now, you may want to develop those actors. It may be very important to ensure that you have capacitated NGOs that are, that have standing and that have the resources and that have true access to the courts and all the rest. And so as long as there are human actors to stand for the uneconomic or the unowned environment, then I don't think there's a basic problem with it being a human rights paradigm. I think we are throwing open a whole set of new questions before we've really built the infrastructure, if you like, for the human rights paradigm. I sometimes would be concerned about that.
I am quite concerned with this question of the link. Yeah, thanks. But just in relation to your first point, in relation to who the actors are, I think the first law review article I wrote was to do with anthropocentrism and the whole idea of social ecology, this interaction between humans and nature, and I was basing it on some of Christopher Stone's work as well as Lawrence Tibe's work, which talked about new foundations for environmental law and whether or not it mattered if you were driving down Los Angeles Boulevard as to whether or not the trees were plastic or whether they were real. This question then of who the actors are brings this question of, can we ever get away from anthropocentricity? Can we be purely egocentric? And my answer is no. And the reason is because these are all purely human constructs. All we can do is to assume that the environment has some kind of intrinsic rights, which the law now starts to recognise in the CBD, but you cannot get away from the fact that they're a human construct, and we have ethical responsibilities to fellow humans as well as the rest of the environment in order to look after them. But we can't say that a tree can be in court. I mean, Christopher Stone, in that article in 1974, said, should trees have standing? And apart from the ambiguity of that question, he came up with, yes, you can, in terms of being able to be represented in court. And what he argued was this. He said, women, at least married women until the 1880s in most Commonwealth countries, did not have separate rights from men. They could only be represented by their husbands. Corporations can only be represented by people. Children can only be represented by people who are adults. And in the same way, he said, if we can represent these things and these people, then we can also represent the natural environment, assuming what rights they have.
I might just begin to just tidy up this little part of the conversation. It's been very interesting in terms of some of the different observations that have been made. I picked up a book just recently in the States on the question of rights-based approaches to environment, specifically in the context of human rights, by a scholar from Harvard Law School. I'm sitting here trying to recall his name because the book's sitting next to my bed back in the Hotel Sun Moon, but I haven't brought it with me. And he's actually arguing there are real dangers in the rights-based approach based on experience with the environmental justice movement in the US. Very interesting, different view, very recently published, and I'm still working my way through it, but there are also, reservations. And I guess I just close it this way. I was just trying to think of this debate in the context of the rather sensitive situation we have down the road from where we're meeting at the ICC with the people in the village there finding themselves now displaced from their homes and looking at significant ecological damage. And I guess if you ask yourself the question, well, what would be would a rights-based solution actually meet their needs in that context? How could it do so? Is it possible that it could? And I don't know. The answer to that is, but I'm not sure that, I'm not absolutely convinced that that's the solution to their particular problem. And I think it goes to the second question finally that Ben said. I mean, it may be, for example, that if you do it through that lens, those people who have such long association with the land might nevertheless be offered some compensation or some alternative, because the focus is on them, but it won't change the damage to the ecosystem or the impacts that flow on from that. So there are questions, I guess, about the limits of a rights-based approach to achieve good environmental outcomes as well. That's the point of the discussion. What I'd like to do next is to invite Lynn Harman to unfold something which has been hatching all day, listening to your discussions and thinking about what was to come here now in the way of well, I'm not sure, Lynn, you can tell us what exactly it's going to look like that you've got on that sheet of paper.
Well, part of our task here for this panel is talking about reasoned decision-making, and that's difficult in a situation like this, but I've come up with a suggestion that you can hack away at and tell me if you know, how to, it's just for a point of discussion. So, let's say that we want to establish a market value for ecosystem services so that we can ascertain whether the local people are getting fair value in exchange for whatever is being taken away from them. There has to be an equal trade at least. And in order to do that, we want to look beyond the immediate present value of whatever payment is made or something like that to what are the long-term consequences of whatever is happening with the local people. So in order to figure out, first of all, whether there is a legal basis for any kind of ecosystem services payment, I just thought I'd sketch out sort of a series of questions to illustrate what I'm talking about. So first of all, the first question is, what are the ecosystem services in this area? For example, in the Amazon forest, the Mata Atlantica, for example, there are many ecosystem services associated with rainforest. And I mean, I can't even begin to enumerate them all, but for the local people, of course, there are things like food, shelter, there's a place to live, water. There are other species that are perhaps useful, plant and animal, and fish.
I have a question.
Yes.
I mean, ecosystem services wouldn't that be goods? Ecosystem goods rather than ecosystem services. I would see more as one
Still can't hear you.
Sorry.
No, I'm
it's
making the
sense like-
distinction between ecosystem services and
Right.
ecosystem goods.
So we also think of ecosystem services in terms of habitat and how it fits in with the climate pattern and that sort of thing. So go ahead and define ecosystem services.
Services, it would be what, well, for example, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is water purification. So it would be something that comes out of those goods.
Right.
Yes. I should have put the slides up afterwards.
But you still can do what?
So we're talking about water purification, habitat,
Carbon sequestration.
carbon sequestration, and so forth.
Yeah, but normally in the deep definition of ecosystem services, goods are included.
Goods are-
Like timber is included as one of it as a provisioning service. provisioning ecosystem service.
Well, here we have the first debate.
So good.
Exactly. Okay. So this
It underlines the fact that the concept itself is vague, but I think Louise is trying to at least make a distinction.
Yeah.
So
Maybe I can add
Yes,
just
go
one thought. I mean, there's a distinction between different types of services, from regulating services to like purification of water or cleaning the atmosphere or whatever, to provisioning services like also providing food, providing water for drinking, etc. So there's
Yes.
there are different categories kind of services. So
And in the past, for example, when people came in and took away the timber from indigenous lands and that sort of thing, not only the provision services were taken away, the provisions were taken away by the ecosystem services as well. It's kind of hard to tear them apart. So as part of reasoned decision making, we can split those two up and figure out how they all fit into this decision about what is to be done with the land, if there's something being done with the land. I was looking at the examples of projects in the brochure that was passed around today. Let's see, where is it? The little green one. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And trying to divide up what are the ecosystem services involved in these projects versus what are the provisions that are being provided by the projects. And really, it's very difficult to separate them out. You want to make sure that you're in taking away the any contracts or any development contracts. You want to make sure that all of these are preserved or at least accommodated for the functions that the ecosystem provides, both for the residents and for the habitat, and the bigger picture items are preserved as well. Does that make sense? So does that make sense from a human rights and nature rights perspective? Yeah.
If I could just add, it seems to me one of the ways to divide the services up are those that impact the local community, taking their livelihoods and perhaps plants, animals that they require for their life. The others, such as water purification, apartments, sequestration, and perhaps biodiversity, is something that's shared by, I guess, a wider community. So either regional community or even the global community. So I think if you're going to divide up between services and goods, that'd be one way to look at it.
Okay. And you have something too? Oh, okay. All right. So that's just a preliminary question. Figure out what's the ecosystem here and who's using it and who has rights to it. We have to get down to who has rights to them.
Lynn,
Yeah.
I have another question.
Sure.
Would you see the preservation of an oil field as an ecosystem service? I mean,
Well, it's carbon sequestration in the sense that it's not.
you say because
certain countries like Ecuador and Congo in certain points are asking money to the international community for the fact that they do not extract a gas field, for example, or do not extract certain natural resources within a natural park.
And how is that different from not cutting down your rainforest?
Exactly. Yeah. So is it a service, and should the international community pay for it?
Right. Okay.
Well, the service may be avoided pollution
yeah,
from the...
and you do not have to build an installation, so you do not.
I'm sorry, I have to object. Because that goes against my understanding of ecosystem services. The services provided by the ecosystem, the avoided, let's say, pollution.
So things that are currently provided by the ecosystem, wetlands and so
that is
forth.
not provided by the ecosystem, because without human interference, there is no pollution. You see, I mean,
It's an extractive industry, but isn't
But
that...
timber
isn't-
also,
isn't
huh?
timber well, anyway, we don't need
If
to
you
get
cut
quite
if
far
you cut a
down in
forest,
this.
it's the same as extracting oil.
yeah, but
It's
you
just
pay.
Where's the
same
difference?
in terms of
Maintain the
carbon.
forest.
But the oil, say in an underground reservoir, is not an ecosystem. It's not providing a service when it's
Exactly.
there. Whereas the forest that you might damage for the extraction of oil is providing a service.
Exactly.
Well,
if you want to talk about it in terms of ecosystem services, you have to look at the cost in terms of the ecosystems provided by that ecosystem of the project, which is the abstraction of the oil.
Yeah, but being busy with soil, for example, if you're going to dig in the soil cannot deliver services, and the soil delivers services.
It's part of the ecosystem. But the oil is not.
At any rate, we don't have to resolve that yet. But let's just put it on the table, because everything we're talking about has a monetary value supposedly, and it could all be frittered away and the whole ecosystem destroyed. So I'm trying to take a more holistic approach. So pardon me for not reviewing the line of traditional ecosystem services, but it could also be separated out, and you could have rights to nature and human rights and so forth. Split up. Okay. So who has those? Who has rights to ecosystem services?
That depends, I would say.
Okay. Who does it depend? What does it depend?
What does it depend on?
Well, it depends again on the type of service we're talking about.
Okay.
For example, I mean, just let's take a normal forest, which can provide different services that we see, from carbon sequestration to the trees, to water filtration, to I don't know, non-timber forest products that it provides, spiritual values or what have you. So practically, there can be different rights for all types of natural resources that are involved in that respect. The land rights can be different from the rights to the tree, to the water, to all that. So
Carbon sequestration might be global.
Exactly.
The rights holders may be
Exactly.
global, whereas
So it could go anywhere from the local people who have traditional use of the land and the forest or whatever, to perhaps the state, the political entity that claims that as its territory. Yes, go ahead.
So sorry, I think the question is not the right one. It's not who is the owner of the ecosystem service. It's who is the who have rights. Sorry, who have right on the ecosystem, not on the service.
Who has rights?
Yes, you
on
can
the
only pay
ecosystem?
something to owner, a provider, or someone who have right on something. And this something is the ecosystem. The ecosystem provides service, but so the right is not on the service, it's on the ecosystem.
Yes, Bernard?
Yeah.
You have a different view? No?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. It also depends on your national legislation and what your national legislation says about ownership. For example, whether a landowner owns a rabbit and birds on his property. And in general, at least in Belgium, it is said that he is the owner of birds and rabbits on his property and trees on his property. So, and that may be different in other countries. And I'm going to add to it also, I wouldn't only look at this too much from a perspective of the lower consuming countries or the developing countries, but also in Western countries or richer countries, there is a lobby of certain banks, of landowners, farmers, etc., of getting money, more money for what they do, for the services they provide. So.
Yes. For example, in my country, farmers are paid to create buffers between their farms and streams, for example, and maintain those without cultivating them.
I know I was just going to make a comment that it might be useful in light of that last comment to distinguish between ecosystem service beneficiaries and people with rights to ecosystem services, because the beneficiaries may not always have legally protected rights.
One example.
If you look at forest products in India, for example, there's a very, very complex set of rules around the felling of trees, but also the taking. Sorry. But also the taking of timber is regulated at different levels of government. So there's a very, very complex web of, and quite confusing web of at least the right to allocate rights, if you know what I mean, or the authority to allocate rights in different types of forest products, which overlap and not always very logical.
Right, and we're having trouble in the United States. We think of property rights, and the landowner has complete rights over everything on the property, right? And sometimes at sea level, up to the sky and down to the middle of the earth. But in fact, it's a bundle of rights, and different parts can be given away or sold.
Just two-word answer: who has rights? Future generations.
Oh yeah. I forgot about future generations. Sorry, everybody does that. Okay.
But Lynn, also before you go on, I mean, even if you think in the context of communities of an indigenous character living in traditional circumstances. There can be circumstances where they may not have the sorts of formal rights to land that have been recognised in their legal system, or there may also be issues around who within their community actually possesses the communal title or whatever, which can then make it very difficult in a legal sense to know whom to deal with in terms of any scheme for payment for custodianship, protection of the ecosystem services. So these are actually questions that become quite difficult when you try to superimpose what is effectively a contractual arrangement onto a communal system of occupation, enjoyment and use of land.
And you weren't here when Harry was describing the biocultural community protocols, but that represents a sort of intermediary between the powers that be and the local people in a way that I think if it doesn't establish rights, it at least establishes organization and some kind of solidarity that certainly may, if not completely entitle people to rights, certainly, give them some bargaining power. Yeah, I know, we've got to go. Okay.